Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane. I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library, and I am super thrilled to have this second session with the two nerdy history girls, Loretta Chase and Susan Holloway Scott, who did this in January, and we had an amazing conversation. And I guess we're going to be having the same thing this time because they haven't changed. So just really quick before we get started, I want to thank the Friends of the Ashland Public Library who support all of our programming, and we couldn't do this stuff without them. So if you're here, you know that Loretta Chase and Susan Holloway Scott are historical authors, historical fiction, historical romance, and they were also the two nerdy history girls with a blog, a very, very, I'm going to say infamous blog of all of the rabbit holes they went down to get to their writing. So you know who they are. Or if you don't, you'll learn more about them today. So we're just going to get started with a question that I have for you guys. Oh, wait, you can put in the chat. You can put chatter. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. We'll do them throughout. So feel free to put a question in the Q&A as soon as you think of it.
Yeah, no question is too silly.
I'll be the judge of that. Okay, so
thanks, Rita.
You're welcome. So anyways, my question to you to get us started is a little bit about yourselves, and also I wanted to know, as I mentioned earlier, like were you always like fascinated by history, and did that inform the direction you went into your writing, or did you know you were going to be a writer and you were like, ooh, I'm going to do historical because I love history?
Who's going first, Loretta?
I'll go first. I knew I was going to be a writer before I knew anything else. So I knew that when I was 7 or 8 years old. When I was 8, I wrote a play. So that told me that makes it very clear to me what was going on. And I think the history came later. I think it takes some of us a long time to appreciate history, partly because of the way it's taught in the schools. We have to memorize a lot of things. We memorize dates. It's about war and politics. It doesn't excite a lot of us. So it was later when I got to college and we started doing social history that I got very interested. I started seeing the connections. I started realizing you could talk about fashion, you could talk about women and what their lives were like. You could talk about households. You could talk about art. So that was where I think it was right around college age that I really developed the appreciation. And then when I started writing novels, it just made sense because I was already loving history.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting because you just seem like history's always been your thing. You know, the deep dives that you do and all. So it's fascinating to me that you started a little bit later down that path. How about you, Susan?
Well, I'm the other way around. I really liked history from, as long as I can remember. And it was more, I just liked old stuff. When I went to the library and I picked up picture books, if it had somebody in a long dress, I'd buy that. I'd, take that one out. And so early on, I was reading a lot on my own. I'm sure everybody read a lot of the same kinds of books, like those early, the YA kinds of history books. Landmark classics were a big, sort of nonfiction kid book. And my parents would sort of humor me. We went on family vacations, so we would always get to go. Say we had a week, they would be going to the beach or playing golf or tennis or something. And then one day Susan would get to go to an old place and they would take me. So I got to see a lot of different places and sort of, started to fill your head full of ideas and different scenes and different characters who were actually really real people. So that I guess I started thinking about telling my own stories pretty early on, but I never thought about being a writer per se until I was done with college. And it just sort of seemed like I wanted that kind of an escape. I'd always liked writing, but I'd never thought of it as a career. And then I just sort of started writing. And it was just like, there was never a question for me that it would not be in a historical setting. Mm-hmm. That was what I enjoyed the most.
Can I ask another question before you guys start riffing off each other? So history books have really changed over the years. I mean, the information we can get now is so different from what it was in some ways from back in the day. I think we're all about the same ages. So I wonder if you like. I remember reading those biographies of like Molly Pitcher and whatever, and then later found out that they're not actually historical fact; they're historical fiction. So, have you found a huge difference in the research you did or the reading you did early on to like now?
Yes. I mean, a lot of as you say, what we learned in school. I mean, to begin with, and my books mostly lately have been set in colonial America around the time of the Revolution. And the way we learned history is that there were three women. There was Martha Washington, Betsy Ross, and Abigail Adams, and there were no other women in the 13 colonies. And I think now history in general is being taught and presented in a much more inclusive way, that it isn't just the old white men, that there's a lot of other people who are part of that same story. And I think that's a really good thing. It's a big history. It isn't a little tiny history.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Loretta?
And I think it's, I've watched it evolve from the time I started writing novels, the kind of history that was available to me, or even the kinds of costumes studies, interpretations of the way people dressed have changed over the years. You get a little bit more of a feminist slant now when you're looking at costume. So people don't automatically assume that a lot of the satirical images that we've seen of people's dress, everyone's seen that one of the woman in the gigantic crinoline dress, those kinds of things, people tended to think that was sort of true, but that was just mocking women's choices. So now we're seeing books on dress that are not as negative about women. Well, let's just say they're not as misogynistic. Let's be frank about that. And I think that's there's a similar case for many aspects of history. We've watched it evolve over the years. As Susan said, from all white men to starting to discover women's history and the history of people of color, and realizing they were part of life, that it wasn't just these few white men who that's all that history is about. So I think we're getting a deeper, more complex picture of the world now.
I think the internet really helps that, because there's so many different voices on the internet. We now have access to so many different kinds of information. There are so many primary sources that are available to us on the internet. And the other side of it is that a lot of terrible misconceptions continue to be perpetrated on the internet. I mean, Loretta's saying the satirical pictures, but you'll still see them on Twitter and stuff saying, look at how stupid women used to be, kind of thing. It's like, no, it was a cartoon. It's not real. So
yeah,
people are better, but then they're not better.
Yeah. Well, I think I sort of made an assumption when we first started here that people do know the two nerdy history girls, and I'm seeing in the chat that people don't know of your blog, but so they're interested in your books, and so that takes me to my next question, which is, has that evolution of historical research, that change over the times, has that informed your books at all? Have they changed over time because of the research that you've been able to do? And then can you talk a little bit about the books that you have written?
Okay.
All right, Susan, I'll let you go first. I
should call on people.
That's a huge question, because the book I just finished is number 55. So yes, they have changed. And when I started out, I was writing historical romance, and it was back in the day when the historical background wasn't that important. It was more, it was all about the story, and it was back when they were still being called bodice rippers, and that was more, I guess everybody had 4 poster beds and wore silk shirts, and no one paid that much attention to it. And even then I was trying to make them more accurate, and my editor would always cut a lot of, that's too much history, take that out. So I think it's gotten certainly in historical romance, it's gotten much more that there are people more aware of history. There's all different kinds of books. You can't just say all the books in historical romance, all the books in historical fiction are better or worse, because there's all different writers and all different readers, and you can find whatever you want. But certainly for me, now I write historical fiction. And so there's much more history. There's still going to be some romance, but it's not a historical romance. It's much more detailed with historical background and historical figures and actions than my earlier books were.
Mm-hmm. Loretta?
So, yes.
And for me, it's been a matter of learning more. When I was I first started writing a traditional Regency romance, we didn't have easy access to information, because there was, this was back in the previous century. There was no internet. It was what I could get from the library or interlibrary loan, and it was a very tedious process. The kinds of things now I can find out in a few seconds. It would take me weeks, or else I couldn't get it. There were books that were only available in the UK, so I have to go there, and that wasn't going to be happening easily or often.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, as I learned more, my books definitely changed as I had access to more information.
Mm-hmm.
And having much more access to primary sources makes a huge difference.
Mm-hmm.
I feel more confident about some of the things. If I write something that seems a little cuckoo, but I know I have some historical background for it. The newspapers are just showing me the craziness. I mean, one beautiful example is we used to make jokes about how we were always having carriage accidents in our novels. Well, the fact is they had carriage accidents all the time in London. It was just, and you read about it in the newspapers, and you read about so-and-so falling off his horse, so-and-so's horse ran off with him in Hyde Park every single day. So, okay, that's a legitimate plot device. It was really happening.
So I guess too, if there are people who don't know who we are, we've both been writing forever, known each other forever, as Loretta said, since the last century. But we had a blog for how long was it, Loretta? Like 10 years?
2000, almost 10 years.
Yeah.
9 years.
What we started out doing is just like research stuff that entertained us, that we would sort of write little blog posts about with stuff we came across. And we would talk on the phone and say, this is so cool. And we didn't think anybody else would be interested, but it turned out a lot of people were interested. And the only reason that we stopped it is it got to be too much, I guess, too much for us to keep going and continue writing. So I know it's much lamented. And everywhere we go, people say, when are you going to start it again? And it's probably not going to happen. But we're doing this instead, because Mina's giving us this platform.
Right.
Well, Caroline Linden, who is also an amazing historical romance writer,
Hi, Caroline.
put in the chat the link to the blog that is still alive. It's just not
we kept it going.
Yeah.
And since it's all old stuff, it doesn't go out of date.
That's right. And if you follow either Susan or Loretta on social media, they're always posting really interesting historical. So definitely do that. But so let's go back onto our conversation about your books and how the research informs it, and what rabbit holes have you gone down recently? That's what I'm curious about.
We're always down rabbit holes. We live in the rabbit hole.
It's like this is a daily thing. Let me see. Maps. I love to look at maps. So someone posted, I think on Facebook, a link to a map that's at Princeton. And I could have spent like 2 hours exploring this map. So because it was a map of 1814 juxtaposed over a current map of London, so that you could see how the streets changed. Mm-hmm. And that was something that I ended up spending like way too much time on, and I had to make myself leave so that I could get some work done.
But I think that's one of those things that also, when we find something, when there's some particular aspect of our research that we enjoy, as Loretta says, the maps. I always have, there's always a scene in one of my books where people are having their portraits painted, because I really I was an art history major in school, and the whole idea of capturing your image for posterity, and that's just, to me, is a fun thing to write about. So I always have that's something that's always in my books too. When in Eliza Hamilton, about Mrs. Hamilton, at one point she goes, her husband Alexander says, there is a man I'm trying to help, he's in debtor's prison, he's a painter, he needs to earn money to get out of debt, and I offered, I would pay him if he would paint your portrait. So she got all dressed up and went down to the New York City jail where he was imprisoned, and had her portrait painted in the jail. And that gave him enough money to get out of the jail. And it also gave him credibility with the other women in New York at the time, who then commissioned him to have their portraits painted too. And it sort of saved his career and his life in a lot of ways. So I thought that was such a great story. So of course, that's in my book. I wrote that into the story too. So it's that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. We find things that you figure out a way to weave it in.
And dressing my heroines is especially a wonderful rabbit hole for me, because here's the scene. What's she wearing? Well, yes, I have a big idea, you're right. And then I go through my fashion prints, and I say, oh, this is a really nice dress, but oh, wait a minute. Here's the fashion print, but where's the dress description? Then you're down the rabbit hole looking for the dress description. Was it in a newspaper? Which magazine was it in? And you're trying to track it down because they stole from one another. And so eventually you can track down most of the descriptions. But I mean, really, I couldn't just look in the picture and say, this is what the dress, no, I want to know what the official description was.
And even that is hard. It's hard for me when I'm writing about real people, because they often just say, Mrs. Washington was beautifully dressed. And they don't say what exactly she wore, or she was dressed as befits a lady of her rank. What does that mean? What does that mean? So I have to go and look at what other women of her rank are wearing, figure out what was available in America at the time. Loretta has access to much better fabrics in London than I do in the colonies. But yes, the clothes, I think too, writing about clothes, which we both love to do, you have to be careful not to sort of turn it into the what are you wearing on the red carpet, kind of just listing everything, because that doesn't tell anybody anything. And no one your characters don't think of their clothes that way any more than you think of, I'm wearing a t-shirt from the Gap and I'm wearing jeans from Old Navy or something. You don't think that way. So you have to figure out a way to describe the clothes so that fit the character's interpretation of them, what they're thinking of wearing, and also make it so that a modern reader can figure out what it is. Loretta and I love to read the descriptions of how clothes are described in the past, but often even we can't figure out what it actually is from the description. Yeah. So we have to figure out a way that readers can see it in their head and sort of experience wearing those clothes too.
Did you say you wear the clothes?
No, just so that a reader can imagine them. I've worn 18th century clothes, just, I've had friends who've dressed me up. You should feel how this works. And it actually is really good to find out that, no, the corsets are not tight. No, you can do anything you want in them. And it's actually, they're pretty comfortable. So that you don't fall into that trap. I think it's worth trying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's really important when you're doing descriptions of clothing or whatever, that it should not stop the action in the story. So that's a balance that you have to strike. How do I get something across about the character through his or her dress without dragging the story down? As Susan said, it's not supposed to be like a red carpet description. And I always, when I'm talking to people who are aiming to get published, or talking about how you use dress in historical novels, I talk about make it part of the action. Make the dress a character. So sometimes you're going to see her dress from his point of view, because maybe she's, as Susan said, not thinking about what she's wearing, but he's noticing, and he's noticing her hair looks really crazy. It's going up like a foot from her head. And that's the way I get across the fashions.
Mm-hmm. So I have like a totally strange question. Were either of you absolutely appalled that one of the Kardashians wore a historical gown to the Met Gala?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, I was horrified.
The pictures that have come out now of how that delicate silk shattered and how it lost beading and how there's rips and tears on it. It's just horrible. And I think it's not only that, it's just the message that there are people in America who are wealthy enough that they think they can do anything, and it seems that they can.
It was awful. It was just awful. That was a piece of history that's been destroyed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I share your opinion.
Well, when all that was going on, there were curators from museum collections, other things, who said that they get requests all the time from people who say, "Oh, I want a dress. Can I borrow that dress to wear to somebody's wedding? I'm a major donor. Can I borrow that dress?" And fortunately, now most big collections would never allow that.
Mm-hmm. It's the same with like museums and libraries. We don't deaccession things just because people want them, to touch. Although there is something about touching stuff, and somebody asked in the chat, and I will get to questions that are in the Q&A, depending on staying on topic. But is that why you visited the Margaret Hunter shop in Williamsburg, to learn how the clothes were made and to touch them?
Yes. And they let you touch them.
Yeah, because they're all reproductions.
They're reproductions.
So you can touch them. But there is, as you're talking about libraries, I love going to archives, historical societies, whatever, and seeing letters, the actual letters that people wrote very carefully. They bring them out to you in the manila envelope and you sign your life away. But because my cat is helping, because there's a real connection to the past when you see actual garments, and or garments or letters or whatever it is, when it's something that's really has been there, it's very inspiring.
Mm-hmm. So Joyce has this interesting question that she's asked both in the Q&A and the chat. What historical dramas have you loved, and does it ruin it for you because you know that they're not historically accurate, some of them?
I have a problem with the lack of historical accuracy. Yes. Sometimes I can overcome it and sometimes I can't. So yeah, I tend to avoid, if I see like trailers and it looks really off, it's hard for me to make that suspension of disbeliff. Just because it's like, it's all wrong, and it gives me the creeps, and it's disturbing.
Yes. There's a new one coming on Netflix that we won't mention, that Loretta and I, all we've seen is the trailer, that I don't think it's on yet, but we are shocked and horrified. We'll let it go with that. But it is, I guess, once you start to see stuff, you just can't enjoy the story, or you can't enjoy the movie because you're just aware of, why is there a zipper on the back of her dress and things like that. Unless the exception of it. I know Loretta hasn't watched Bridgerton, and I did. And I actually by the end, I really enjoyed it, because I know I just accepted it as a total fantasy and didn't try and say, oh, look, this is not right. This is not, because nothing was right. And I enjoyed it because of that, because just sort of accepting it as a fantasy. It's the ones that try and be accurate, sort of, that drive me nuts.
They go off. But Susan and I were just talking about one that was done fairly recently, Gentleman Jack, which I was really impressed with the dress in that show. And I thought they did a very interesting job of making the main characters deciding how she was going to dress, based on, they only had a small amount of information, but it really seemed to fit. And the rest of them, it was great. The hair, the dresses, the big sleeves, because that's my time period. So I was delighted. And
Well,
it was
and
lovely to see people moving in those clothes, rather than a static fashion print.
Well, and they did what we try to do, which is the clothes are not just there draping a mannequin. They're actually part of the character. And they just, when you see them come in and how they move, as Loretta said, you immediately understand who they are as people by their clothing choices. So that was a really good one.
Yeah.
Just wearing prom dresses.
So Joyce asked if you like the 2020 Emma by Autumn de Wilde.
I loved it.
Yeah, I'd like that one too. I
Yeah,
know a
I
lot
thought
of people
some people
don't like
hated
that
it,
one.
but I loved it.
Yeah, I liked it too because it was over the top.
Yeah, that was it. And Emma's not my favorite book. So I tend to like the interpretations of it that I've seen in the movies, including the ones that are done with, for like a high school type of interpretations. Like what was Clueless was a great example. So I did love, I loved it. And then the costumes were fabulous. They were just
I really liked
a treat for the eye.
They took a lot of care with the room settings and everything too, and the wacky wallpaper, which sort of reflected the interest in the same prints that are being used in the clothes. And it was just that was real, very super stylish and super fashionable at the time. And when you see the clothes in the settings, it was like, oh, this all makes sense. It all, it's a taste.
Yeah.
So Caroline says the Fashion Museum in Bath, where they went a few years ago, had sample clothes based on museum pieces for people to dress up in, and her kids loved it. And let's see, Lois asks, we're going back to the Kardashians, where did she obtain the dress? Like, who would allow her to wear it?
Oh, it was at Ripley's Wax Museum owns it somehow or another. It isn't like the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's somebody that probably was glad to get the publicity too. And I have no idea how they got it. But yeah.
That's sad. So these are a little bit off topic, but I'm going to go there. Jan asks, what's your favorite way of discovering new books? I like finding out which authors are friends. I've made some great discoveries that way.
One thing that Caroline Linden has turned people on to this. BookBub is a great way to discover new authors very inexpensively. They'll every week they'll show you the books that are on a special deal, like $1.99 or $2.99 or something like that. And it's a great way to try out new authors that you might not be familiar with. That way you can buy 10 books instead of 3 or whatever, and try them out. Lots of times it's word of mouth. Susan will mention a book to me and then I'll go hunt it down, or someone else mentions a book. When I've been at Colonial Williamsburg, sometimes the interpreters will talk about a book and then I have to track it down. But it's not necessarily a new book, but it's new to me.
But sometimes when I talk to other people, a lot of historians are working on research and they'll recommend other books or books that they're working on. And I may have been sort of following their research all along and I can't wait to see it finally as a book. So I think sometimes a lot of it is word of mouth.
Yeah.
And social media. I discover some of them on the historians on social media and learn about new books that way too.
And your local library.
Yes.
Just putting in a plug.
No, I mean that it's always that front shelf with the new releases that everyone always makes a beeline for in the library.
So true. So Mary asks, are there any favorite Austin-based modern retellings that are your favorite? And I'm going to add to that, because they're as historically accurate as possible.
Well,
I thought we both agreed on Emma, right? We liked Emma, and Gentleman Jack, but that was not Jane Austen. Sorry. I mean, I'm still in love with the Colin Firth and Pride and Prejudice from 1995. I just
the white shirt.
Really yes, the white shirt.
But the costumes were amazing. They were for the time period they picked, and they were very consistent about the costumes, which I liked.
Mm-hmm.
I liked, I guess probably my favorite is the 1990s Persuasion, because they didn't try and make everybody glamorous. And it really, I mean, that's sort of a melancholy book anyway. It's not a romp. And I think that version of the book really
Agree.
worked. It really
Yeah.
worked. And it wasn't, sometimes I think they get into, they have a problem like all movies, but it's especially historically set ones where they want to have a star as the lead. This cat is the star. They want to have a star. And so that star, whether they're presented that way or not, it's like I'm thinking about Keira Knightley, who always has smoky eye makeup, regardless of what time period, messy bun, smoky eye. And it always just kind of is jarring because you see that as like a modern person, and even if all the other characters are historically accurate. There's the star, there's Keira. So I think that makes it hard.
Mm-hmm. And the rules don't apply because it's Keira.
It's Keira.
Right.
And so I think that some of those older English, the BBC shows, where as Americans, we didn't recognize a lot of those people, was actually better because of that. You didn't see them as stars. You just saw them as Jane Austen characters.
Yes.
So Elizabeth asks, how do you feel about historical mysteries? She loves C.S. Harris's Sebastian St. Cyr Regency series, and she pays a lot of attention to historical London.
I don't read them, so I can't. I have to step away from that one, but I know Loretta is a mystery reader. So.
I love mysteries, but most of the historical mysteries I'm reading a later period, and I discovered a few years ago the series that's set in the 1930s in I believe in Cincinnati, and it's a private detective who's a woman, and it's really well done. It's one of those books where when I finish the book, I feel sort of lost because I miss the characters. She has created such a beautiful world. It's M. Ruth Myers. And the series is a Maggie Sullivan series. So that's one that I really love. It's I read a lot of the classic mysteries too, over and over again. Of course, Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers and those, but not so much the Regency mysteries. I'm not sure. Maybe it's because I'm just so steeped in Regency history that I don't want to, or that I don't read them. And some of the mysteries I found a little too dark for me, so I don't.
Terry asks, what fact or category do you find most often misrepresented in literature or film?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Like, what is most historically inaccurate usually? I think that's what she's saying in literature or film. Is it the costumes? Is it usually the settings? Is it the mannerisms? I was going to ask about language. Is the language, like if you read some historicals, they're talking like a modern person. Is that most represented? Is it the messy hair bun?
It's hard because if you do something, if you try, well, for one thing, you can never totally recreate the past. You just can't do it because you're part of your own time. You can't do it. But if you get too caught up in writing exactly the same way, then it's inaccessible to modern readers. So you have to come up with the balance. I mean, I get really stupid and weird doing work, making sure I don't use words that weren't used at the same time period. And you can check that all the time on your computer. So you're constantly going back and forth. When was this word first in use? But I try not to write too much like an 18th century person, because I don't have a problem with that, but most readers are not going to go there.
Right. I mean, I just spoke to someone recently who was saying it took her a few pages to get used to the style of language of my books. And then once she got into it, it was okay, but it took her a bit. So that's something that we have to keep in mind. I mean, I try to keep the balance, as Susan said, between not using language that wasn't used then, but keeping it still accessible. it's difficult because our vocabulary today is, I don't know how many times larger than it was in, say, 1830. And words that we use to explain things or express states of mind even were not heard of.
That's what, yes.
It's really hard sometimes to communicate certain emotions.
Well, things
So
like something really obvious like relationship, that's a modern word. And when you're trying to explain, they're not friends, but they're not, you know, they're not betrothed, but they're really close, or you know, it's hard to come up with stuff.
yeah.
And do you find that because if most of your historicals are set in other countries? I know, Loretta, you've had places in Cairo and England, and Susan, you've also been like sort of all over the place. So how does the language affect those books? Because you're writing about a different place for an English audience, an American English audience.
For a great part, I rely on sources, the ways someone characterized a situation in a book that was written at the time period. But you have to be careful with that, because there's a lot of attitude and prejudice that appears that I mean, I know early on in my career, there were when I set books in other places, because I was using materials from that time period, I didn't realize the slant, that I had this English superior slant on the natives, you know. So now I wince a little at the way I created those characters, or the way that they spoke, but that was just ignorance. I mean, I didn't know more than what my sources gave me. So it's tricky, and even now, you have to be careful about what your sources are, and you have to put them into perspective when you're writing the stories.
It can be a real challenge, because you don't want to be anachronistic. I think one of the hardest things is sometimes people will look at your heroine and say, you know, why did she put up with that? Why did she do that? And it's like, because that was the norm for the time, and she would not behave like a woman in 2022. You can't make her do that, but you can't make her a total sap either. So introducing the feisty heroine. But I think sometimes it's difficult for modern readers just to sort of accept what the roles were, unless you can find extraordinary women in their time period who were bucking the norms for their time too. But it's hard to do back to the language, to not do dialect too, because we've all read books where you can't begin to figure out what they're actually saying, because the dialect is, somebody's gone crazy. So I think it's kind of easier to keep them talking, all the characters talking in some semblance of modern English.
Right. Well, I always think that like people are people. Their human nature it's historic. Like we're just how we are. You know, there were feisty people back in the, you know, throughout history, and women, and you know, that's the new history we're learning about. Caroline writes in the chat that she doesn't know. She says, I don't know. Get yourself an effing friend is from the 1600s. And then she also asks, completely innocently, are there any historical research sites in London that are not to be missed? She's asking for herself because she's going there in 2 weeks.
I'm so jealous. Oh. Wow, where do I begin? Well, there's the London Transport Museum, which is really fascinating. And let me see. You don't want to miss the Old Bailey. You can go in there and watch. You can actually watch cases being tried. The British Museum, the National Portrait Gallery, the Natural History Museum, all those, there were a million museums in South Kensington. to visit. I should compile a list. I have a whole spreadsheet of places to visit that I put together for my last visit to England, and I'm now compiling additional places to visit. And this is just in London. London is infinite. I don't even know where to begin to suggest places, like off the top of my head. So, Caroline, I'll send you my list.
I'm feeling a little left out. I feel like I need that list too. I've not been going to London. I just want to know because I love history and I love like being able to walk into a 16th century pub or whatever it is in London and know that it's been there since, you know,
18th century.
There's a place that has rooms that are, each room is decorated in the style of a particular era. The whole room is just set up. And right now I'm not getting the name of the place. So yeah, that sort of thing is there.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just the Tower of London.
No, that's for tourists. How about you, Susan? Any particular recommendations?
No, because I've never been there.
Oh,
So
have you?
I just listened to Loretta.
I sort of feel like you've had some books set there, right?
Oh yeah, I've set books all over the place that I haven't been. I think that's always like one of the greatest compliments. I guess my last book started out in India, and I had obviously never been to India, but I had people ask me where did I stay when I did my research. It's like, no, I haven't never been there. So that's what imagination is for, I guess. Research and imagination.
Right. That's how I got to Cairo.
Yeah.
Right. And, you know, mystery writers aren't asked that. They aren't asked, like, when's the last time you were a serial killer, you know, like seeing it into the head.
Well, and I think, too, that even if you go back to London and there's still all these wonderful historic sites and stuff, it's still not, it's like Loretta, it's not 1830. And that's why you need the things like the maps to be able to see what was here, what wasn't there, to, you know, to sort of figure out what it was like in your time period for your characters.
So we're getting a lot of really great recommendations too in the chat. But I want to say, have you guys ever watched Drunk History?
Yes, I would love to be on Drunk History.
For those of you who don't know, it's a show that recreates historical events.
Yeah.
But the narrator is always drunk. And so it's very accessible, I'll say. Okay, so Teresa asks for both of you, what is the best piece of writing advice you received that you still use in your own writing?
Advice that we were given or advice that we would give or
that you were given?
Yeah.
Book.
Teresa, you stumped them.
No, I guess it probably is just kind of keep going until you have till it's done, because you can't sell a book until the book is done. If that's your goal. I think you can get caught up in just polishing and reworking and then actually never get it done. So finish it and then you can go back and mess around with stuff. Yeah, Loretta's looking at me. We both have problems with this. That's so we can talk about it.
Yeah, right now it's not coming to me. No writing advice is coming to me.
So I'll just say the best writing advice I always hear from authors is just to write, as you just said, just sit down and do the work.
Yeah.
And yeah, if you don't write, it won't get written.
You don't have it. No.
Exactly.
And I write 7 days a week. There's no time off.
Oh, wow.
And that doesn't mean that everything is a wonderful, you know, a pearl of genius or anything. There's a lot of times you sit down and the next day and delete everything you wrote the day before, but you do it.
Right. But that's part of the process.
Yeah. I sometimes things just aren't right. And I think sometimes you have to sort of figure out where the story is going to go. And the only way you can do it is to write it out. And then perhaps you realize that wasn't the way it was supposed to go. It's supposed to go in a different direction, but we tried that and now we'll do something else.
So let me go back to the historical question about that. have you ever rewritten something because you learned something new about that history?
Oh,
Do you mean rewritten after it was published or
No, no,
before?
just as you were writing.
can
Yeah, go ahead.
I have an answer. There was just recently, and when I guess modern events horribly repeat things that have happened in the past. And in the book I finished on Martha Washington, she's leaving during the American Revolution. She's escaping New York City and going south. And she, as the general's wife, she's in a big carriage. She can, she has a guard and everything, but she's also leaving the city with thousands of refugees, all these other women and children, all all trying to escape before the British will bombard the city. And I didn't really give it much thought until I saw the people who were leaving, refugees from Ukraine, and seeing how poignant it is when people they can only take what they can carry, and the kinds of things, whether it was a pet carrier or one suitcase or whatever. And I tried to incorporate that. I went back in and wrote that people are carrying wicker cages with their pet bird. They have just, they don't have rolly suitcases, but they have a wheelbarrow with their one most treasured possession as they're trying to escape. And I thought that some things, as I said, have not changed, but it can influence your writing in the past too.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Loretta? Have you had to edit something because you're like, oh, this is not accurate anymore?
Well, that happens all the time in the course of writing a book.
That does happen.
Yeah, I'm always fixing things. I'll have an idea for a scene, and then I'll realize, well, that couldn't have happened that way, or that street didn't exist, or there are quite a few cases where I wish I could go back and rewrite the book, but I'm not going to do it. Where I put something in that was like, one that really bothers me is, I had a toll gate at Hyde Park Corner in a story, and at that time it had already been taken down, and it made me crazy. It makes me crazy to know I did that, but what can you do?
I know people think that you can go back and re-edit books, and it's like, no, it's done.
No.
And I think one that bothers me the most is when I wrote Eliza Hamilton, I guess 2016. And since then, there has been new research done that Alexander and Eliza Hamilton did in fact have enslaved servants on their staff. And at that time, no one had confirmed it, but said no research has it now. And I would have incorporated that into the story and not just talked about their servants. But yeah, there's nothing, it's done, it's in print, can't change it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even an ebook, you can't go back and change it.
No, the editors would love us if we did that.
But it would take away from like if you could just go in and change any little thing, then it's not really the finished product.
Yeah. You have to let it go.
Right. Loretta, somebody asked this early on, which I think is awesome. Wondering if Loretta will be putting out some of your older books in audio. She loves all of your books. It's always given me a good giggle. Love The Lion's Daughter. Would love to hear that while washing. Audiobooks make laundry much better.
I think it's supposed to be an audio, actually. If she can't get it, it might mean that the license has expired and didn't get renewed. But if that's the situation, I wish the reader would let me know so that I can tell my agent that it's not available. But as far as I know, all my books are supposed to be available in audio.
I see it in Audible. I'm looking right now. I don't know if you're an Audible user, but I'll just throw that in there in the chat. I just put that in the chat. Yeah, I listen to audiobooks for everything. Walking, driving,
right.
For me, it's a performance. It's and I wonder, Susan, I'm interested in, are your books on audio like the more historical ones, and do they really lend themselves to the audio format?
Yes, because I think they do. The first two that I've done more recently, I'm trying to think back. Most of them have been first person, so I think they really work with a narrator, because she's telling you the story. She's telling you her life. So I think I think they do very well. Though I know not from my book so much, but I'm sure everybody's had the experience that a really good narrator will really make a book, just as a bad narrator will just make you go, nope, I don't want this person's voice in my head.
Yeah.
So we're almost out of time. We just have a few more minutes. So if anybody has any last questions, please throw them into the Q&A. But I was wondering, because we had talked about this early on, is if you could pick like one historical fact from one of your books and talk a little bit about how you found it. Maybe it's your favorite one, maybe it's the most obscure one, maybe it's the one that made you go down a rabbit hole for a week. One.
A fact.
I can start it.
Huh? You're going to make me go first, or you're going to start?
No, I can start it.
Okay, you can start.
I might have told the story the last time, but I'm going to tell it again anyway, because it really was a strong one. I was visiting, I had made arrangements to visit a library in Kensington, and the librarian very kindly took us into the archives and showed me a gun, a rifle. And he said, this belonged to the Baron de Beranger. And I'm like, who's the Baron de Beranger? And his eyebrows went up. And so he told me about the Baron de Beranger and how this man had created this place in Chelsea. He had bought this big property, and it had turned it into sort of not a pleasure garden, but kind of an athletic area for people to learn different things, like to practice archery, to practice shooting. There was some kind of strange device where you rode on a horse and tried to chop off fake heads and that sort of thing. And that's when, and I just couldn't get it out of my mind. And so I came back, I read all about the Baron de Beranger. He's just a fascinating human being. I read all about his arena that he created in Chelsea, which later became Cremorne Gardens. And it ended up being a part of my story, 10 Things I Hate About the Duke. So that was, yeah, I became obsessed, and I think it made a really strong scene too. So it was good.
I will agree with that.
And again, it's the people who keep the archives and the librarians and stuff who bring out these treasures to share with us. I guess not so much an a plot thing, but something that I just found incredibly inspiring. When I was working on the Eliza Hamilton book, I was in the rare book library at Columbia University, which has a lot of Hamilton stuff. And mainly I wanted to see some of the, excuse me, some of the embroidery that Eliza had done. For some reason, they had them there. And the librarian said, you know, we have her wedding ring. And I said, really? And she brought it out, and it was what's called a gimmel ring. It's two rings that fit together. It's like a puzzle that goes together. And so two gold rings linked. One had Alexander's name on the inside, and the other one said Elizabeth. And then they snap together and make it one, which is just a wonderfully symbolic, you know. Oh. And so she took it out of the box and she said, do you want to hold it? And it was just like, I did, and it was really tiny. It made me think, Eliza was a really little woman, but it was just like, it was such a moment to be able to know that she wore that her long life. And now I had touched it. So I guess that's like, just like you get sometimes you get those historical jolts, and it really helped make her a much more real person to me, knowing that I had done that.
I just got the chills.
It really was when she brought it out. I was like, my eyes filled up. I was like, oh my God. You know, so, yeah, librarians have the best treasures.
Yes, we do. Yeah, we do. I think that is both of your examples are so good about how you know something sparks your imagination and gets into your story, but also makes you want to know more and more, makes the reader want more and more. Because I know I've been the same. Like I've read your books and then I've been like, oh wait, I don't understand that. I'm gonna go and look it up. Or I need more. I need more about that.
Well, I think that I know Loretta and I both feel the same way. We've talked about it. Is that one of the reasons that we try and get it right is that we know that people will get that if we've written it right, they'll want to know more, and then they will go off and look for other things. And that, you know, we want to spark them, I guess, the right way. We don't, you know, we feel it's a certain responsibility to try and get it as right as we can, rather than making up all sorts of bizarro stuff.
Yeah.
We make up enough bizarro stuff, but I mean, the history we try and get right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I went to see Hamilton, I remember like being on my phone being like, you know, how many kids did he have? When did he die? But
there's a lot of things that are not quite, you know, edited for dramatic purposes. But even the Hamilton, you sort of think everybody knows how that story ends, right? But when I went to see the play, there were people behind us, and the man, you know, at the end, I guess I won't spoil in case there are people who don't know how that play ends, but everyone's cheering, and the man just was like, well, I certainly didn't see that coming. And it's like, so you never know.
That's funny. Yeah, that's so funny. Yeah, somebody, when we went to see Hamilton, somebody near us was like, where did it come up with these ideas? Like they didn't even know
it was all there.
So I think, but you know, obviously, like being in that arena or reading the books or whatever, really makes somebody who already loves history just want to dig deeper. And I think that that's what you do for me at least, and I think for many of your readers. Because Jane says right now, I would like to say thank you to both of you for many hours of reading and listening pleasure. Loretta, I have read and listened to every single one of your books, and you are my absolute favorite historical romance writer. Thank you. And
thank
Susan,
you.
I am going to be catching up on your work because you sound awesome. So, but I think that that's a typical, like whenever I hear anybody talk about our talks here, they're just like, oh, wow, I am gonna, if I haven't read it, I'm gonna, because
that's great.
Yeah.
Great.
So before we go, I do want to ask you about what's coming up next for you in terms of books. I know, Susan, you have a book coming out in 2023, and Loretta, I didn't see anything on fantastic fiction for you, but I'm sure you're working on something.
I'm working on something, but I've had a struggle. So it was supposed to come out this year, but it's just having difficulties. But I'm still working on it. It's going to get done eventually. It's one of those things Susan and I have talked about. It's just, you have to sit down and do it. And if you don't write, it won't get written. So you just keep at it until it comes together.
Mm-hmm.
Just like everybody else in the world, these last 2 years have been hard on writers. Our imaginations are too good. And we get distracted.
Yeah, so I'm supposed to be doing the third book in the series, the Dukes series, and that's the one that I'm struggling with. So if people are wondering what's happened with the Blackwoods, well, I don't know yet.
You'll get there.
The character's fighting too much, so you can't get. No, you don't have to go into detail. I'm sure there's a lot.
Let's not.
Yeah. How about you, Susan? Tell us about Martha, right?
Martha is coming out, and it's I think everybody imagines Martha Washington as that grumpy looking old woman with the big hat on. But this is all mostly about young Martha. It goes through the American Revolution, and she did a lot, had an exciting life up to that point. So I hope to sort of change people's conceptions about her, thinking back to when, you know, what she was like as a ambitious young woman, which we don't think of.
Mm-hmm. I love the histories that you're putting on for these women because, as you said, we haven't heard their histories that much.
No.
We've only heard a certain perspective of them. So you just bring it to life.
Well, and I think too that in the past, they're always just sort of labeled as being the wife of, the mother of. When I went to the Hamilton graves in New York, you know, Alexander has this, if anybody's been there, this huge thing with pillars, and it's the obelisks and all sorts of stuff. It's a very large thing. And poor Eliza just has a slab in the ground. And for all the things that she did, I mean, she outlived Alexander by 50 years. So she did a lot of really good things. And she's just listed as her father's daughter and her husband's wife and nothing else. So
So as a romance reader, I'm just going to say that Alexander Hamilton seems like he was overcompensating for something, even in death.
Yes, that's sort of the impression you get.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. It didn't go down paths I expected. So I appreciate all of your thoughtfulness and humor about just talking about whatever came up.
Thank you,
Well,
Mina.
thank you for having us. We have a lot of fun, and that hour just flew by.
Yes, it did.
It did, for me too. And you just make it easy with all of your knowledge, and I just think it's pure fun, actually. So thank you again. Thank you, everybody, for being here, and
Yes, thank you.
I will hopefully talk to you all soon. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.